Today we're going to finish our series on how to design your very own Zentangle doodles. And also in today's video, we're going to see the first ever viewer-submitted artwork on this channel. If you would like to have your artwork showcased, send it to the email on the screen below, myart@mrnew.com. And be sure to leave a note in that email to let me know whether or not you want me to share it in a video.
Welcome back to Mr. New's art class. It's wonderful to see your smiling faces today.
The three tools we're going to be using today are overlapping, shading, and thinking outside the string. For starters, overlapping is what happens when you have a pattern with another pattern behind it. Now, in some ways, I've already shown this worked into other patterns, but here I'd like to show how you actually would go about doing it. The first thing I need to do in order to overlap patterns is to start by thinking of any pattern, and it could be one that we've already practiced, or I could make up a new one, but it needs to have some empty space in the background so that you can put another pattern in that background space. For example, in this picture, you see that the main part of the pattern is these vertical rows of helical shapes with dots in the middle. And then there's a background pattern of these horizontal lines with diagonal boxes. This pattern would work really well for having overlapping. Instead of filling the background black, I could do the same foreground pattern, but then put a different pattern here instead of the black. What I think I'll do for this is make some stripes that go in lots of different directions. And this is a pattern I've done before. As a matter of fact, it's one of my favorites. But I'm going to change up the background in it. Now, the reason I chose to do this particular pattern is because I wanted to talk to you about the difference between having overlapping elements within your pattern versus having two patterns, one in front of the other. What I would normally do for this pattern is just color the background spaces black. Instead, what I'd like to do is fill the background with another pattern. Perhaps I'll do this one since it's something easy that I've already got here. And there you see we have two different patterns, one overlapped on top of the other. I thought about doing a third pattern overlapped under instead of coloring the background black, but I decided to keep things a little simple for this tutorial. You also see that I did some shading, which is what we're going to talk about next. But before we move on, I want to, at this point, show you a viewer-submitted artwork that uses both of these ideas, overlapping and shading, quite well. This Zentangle was submitted by someone from the Netherlands, whose name I am probably going to get wrong, Joke Loosenkamp. Joke, if you're watching, please let me know in the comments below whether or not I got your name right. And if I pronounce it wrong, I am so sorry. As we take a closer look at Joke's Zentangle, notice how the foreground patterns here are drawn with black ink and shaded with graphite pencil. And notice that there are background patterns drawn in what looks like a sepia or umber tone, some kind of reddish brown. One of the things I truly love about this piece is the way that the organic lines and shapes within the patterns themselves juxtapose against the square and rectangular frames to create really intricate negative spaces. Notice that nearly every section of this Zentangle uses overlapping to have more than one pattern in the same space. And as we move on to talk about shading, notice the different ways that Joke used shading in his Zentangles. Around the edges of the Zentangle, we see what looks like a cast shadow, almost lifting the whole piece off of the paper that it's drawn on. Whereas within the leafy and mushroomy shapes shown here, shading is used to create a three-dimensional illusion. In either case, the pencil shading is used to create a three-dimensional form or space. And now, as we move on to a demonstration of how to shade, I'll start here by gaining inspiration from some of the patterns that we saw in Joke's Zentangle. In particular, I'm going to use one of the background patterns that I noticed Joke used. Now for this pattern, I simply created semicircles that go in rows of 5. It's like a semicircle with 4 auras around it. I think in Joke's picture he did a series of 4 instead of a series of 5, but it doesn't really matter how many you do. The point is, it ends up looking like sort of like overlapping scales. Now, interestingly, the shaping of it does give us that overlapping feel. But watch how shading can be used to create an even more layered, overlapping feel to this. What I'm going to do is look for the outermost ring of each set and shade around it. Not inside it, around it. There, by doing that, it makes it look like this set of rings is resting on top of the rest of the pile, and it's casting a shadow onto the rest of the pile around it. If we repeat that for every single one of these groups of rings, we'll see a really cool three-dimensional effect. Let's do it. And there you can see how shading each one of those really ends up making a really cool layered effect. Now, this is just one example. There are literally infinite different ways to use shading to your advantage. But try different ways of shading different types of patterns and see how you can create depth in your very own patterns. For my last tutorial on how to draw your own Zentangles, I want to talk about thinking outside the string. Now, here's what that means. Normally, when we start a Zentangle drawing, we'll start by drawing a string that goes throughout our image. And then we draw different types of patterns in the different spaces that that creates. One thing you can do is allow your patterns to overlap across the string. For example, notice how I just drew this little cherry or mushroom looking shape, and it overlaps on top of that string. The string goes right here underneath it. If I really cared, I could get out an eraser and erase the string that goes under it, but I'm not really worried about that, especially because I might add some shading that would cover up part of that string. Let me go ahead and finish this up and then show you why thinking outside the string can be super, super important. There, now notice that I went outside of the string in quite a few different areas, not just one time. I pretty much just used the string as a general guideline on where I wanted things to be instead of actually trying to stay inside the string. Now what I can do is I can start to make other patterns in these other spaces and let them overlap behind this pattern. For example, notice how I kept this pattern within the bounds of that string, but these cherry-looking things overlap on top of it in several areas. I'll do other patterns in these two areas just to re-emphasize that point. Next, I'm going to implement a little bit of shading into this first pattern just to kind of hide that string where it's underneath those shapes. And I know some people have unwritten rules about not using erasers in their artwork, particularly in the Zentangle style. I've even read it in books saying, you're not supposed to use an eraser when you make a Zentangle. But erasers are a really useful tool that a lot of artists use for a lot of different reasons. It's not just for erasing mistakes, and I think that's the reason why most of the Zentangle books that I've read say don't use erasers. It's because they're trying to let you think about mistakes in a different way. I haven't made a mistake. What I've done is I've added a bunch of value, and now I want to use a kneaded eraser to pull some of that value off and make highlights. It's just a tool. It's not for getting rid of mistakes. So I'm just lightening up some of the value on the right-hand side of each of these little shapes. Give it a little bit of a three-dimensional feel. And then I can go back in and darken the left-hand side a little bit more. And that will just help to emphasize that three-dimensional feel. I'm going back into this shading thing, but really, this right here, I'm trying to show you how all of these things can come together to create a full Zentangle picture. And here, by adding shading to just one of the many patterns in that picture, what I've done is pulled it up and emphasized it so the focus is on that one. That is also helped by overlapping that pattern in front of the others, and by having that pattern be the only one that goes outside of its own boundaries. And there, I think that'll finish up my series on how to draw your own Zentangle doodles. We've learned a lot over the last couple of weeks, and I hope that you've been able to take something from this, learn from this, and use these concepts, these ideas, in your own drawings, whether they're Zentangles or other kinds of doodles, or even other kinds of more formal artwork. I hope you enjoyed the viewer-submitted artwork today, and I hope that y'all will send me some more of that. I really enjoyed sharing that with you today, and I really want to share more of those. So again, I'm going to put that email address on the bottom of the screen, myart@mrnew.com. Send me all you got. Send me any Zentangles you've ever made. I'd love to start sharing more of those. Also, if you're interested in learning other art tips outside of the Zentangle process, I do a weekly series on other art tips as well that comes out every Thursday. These Zentangle videos come out every Sunday. And as always, if you have any questions, comments, or want to learn any specific tutorials, leave a comment down below. I'd love to help you grow.